Good evening. My name is Rabbi Daniel Lehman. I'm the president of the Graduate Theological Union, and it's my pleasure to welcome you here to this annual Dr. Surjit Singh Lecture. First of all, let me thank Zaytuna College for hosting us this evening. I want to thank especially President Sheikh Hamza Yusuf Hansen for his hospitality and his support and the relationship that GTU has with Zaytuna over the years, and I hope it will continue to develop and mature and blossom in the coming months and years as well. So thank you to Zaytuna for this great hospitality. The Dr. Surjit Singh Lecture is really the high point of the GTU year in terms of bringing internationally renowned thinkers and speakers to the GTU and broader community, and this year is absolutely no exception. When I was first told that I had to invite, as the new president here, the lecturer for this Singh lecture, the first person that came to mind immediately was our guest speaker this evening, Eboo Patel, and I will introduce him just in a moment. But I did want to begin by indicating how significant Dr. Singh's leadership was, both at the San Francisco Theological Seminary, which is one of our GTU member schools in San Anselmo, but also here at the GTU as a professor for many, many years. There was a great devotion both to SFTS as one of the important seminaries of the GTU, as well as to the GTU doctoral program, which is near and dear to his heart. So we're particularly appreciative to the Singh family. This is the 28th annual Singh Lectureship, and we appreciate their support and their commitment to the GTU. And unfortunately, Dr. Singh's daughter could not be with us this evening, but she was very excited to hear that Dr. Patel was going to be delivering the lecture this evening. In many ways, both Dr. Singh and this lectureship embodies the interreligious commitment of the GTU. We were just talking over dinner with Dr. Patel about the fact that what started off as a very important ecumenical institution, bringing together a wide variety of Christian seminaries in order to generate a combined PhD program, has in more recent years become a center of interreligious study. And I think that very much represents the kind of commitment that Dr. Singh made in his teaching, in his scholarship, and in the way that this particular lectureship was developed as a lectureship specifically focusing in on a comparative religion and theology. And I think it's very important to note that in this particular era that we're living in, the specter of religious hatred is obviously still very present. I think we're all still reeling from the attacks of the mosques in New Zealand. Just a few hours ago, the GTU as a community gathered outside of the chapel at PSR, the Pacific School of Religion, in order to express our grief, our concern, our support for the Muslim community, both here and around the world, and our commitment as an interreligious institution to the kind of compassion, conversation, and concern from one another that has been the hallmark of the GTU for these many years. One of the most significant leaders of the interreligious movement in the United States is our speaker this evening, Dr. Eboo Patel. I have known him for a number of years, and in my previous position in Boston at Hebrew College, we met. Eboo came and spoke, consulted with us about the interreligious work that we were involved in there, and in many ways has been a thought leader for me personally, but more importantly, I think for the entire country, around the questions of what it means to develop interreligious capacities, interreligious leadership, and in fact, an interreligious polity here in the United States. He is a prolific author, including books entitled Acts of Faith, Sacred Ground, Interfaith Leadership, and most recently, a book that I've just been reading, Out of Many Faiths. And in fact, I just recommended to the GTU Council of Presidents, which represents the various institutions that are members of the GTU, that we use that book, Out of Many Faiths, as the basis for a year-long conversation next year in which we take up the ideas that Dr. Patel has put forward in that book, and we continue the conversation by responding, discussing, and trying to provide our own contribution to the dialogue that he has generated around interreligious realities here in the United States and how we conceive of them as a part of our American future. He holds a doctorate in the sociology of religion from Oxford University, where he studied on a Rhodes Scholarship. And most importantly, he is the founder and president of the Interfaith Youth Core, which is a national nonprofit working to make interfaith cooperation a social norm. It's headquartered in Chicago. And we're just delighted to have Eboo with us to share what I think is a very provocative talk entitled How Religious Education Can Make America Great, Reflections on Diversity, Tribalism, and Interfaith Leadership. I can think of no one better to be able to stimulate and provoke our GTU community and the wider community of those interested in religion in America than Dr. Eboo Patel, and it's my great pleasure to welcome him and to ask him to share his thoughts with us this evening.
Bismillahirrahmanirrahim. Well, thank you so much, and I am absolutely thrilled to be here. I was very moved by the vigil earlier. I don't want to go to vigils. None of us do. It's because horrible things happen in the world. But if horrible things are to happen, to be with a community of care under expert pastoral leadership is really important. And I was very moved to be there. So thank you so much for creating and holding that space. A couple other notes before beginning. The opportunity to come out here is an honor and a pleasure in a very deep way. I got to reconnect with a very good friend of mine, Munir Jiwa, after 2 decades. And Munir and I, for a period of our grad school careers, would talk to each other once a week, once every 2 weeks. I was at Oxford, he was at Columbia, and what he has built here is so impressive and so important. And this whole complex is so impressive and so important. I'm standing inside the first Muslim college in America, right? That's a big deal, right? Like it is a contribution to American civilization that will have impact for centuries on the nature of that civilization itself. It is a great honor to do that, and I consider Sheikh Hamza something of a mentor, although I'm not sure if he will have me in the reverse of that. And I have a friendly acquaintance with Imam Zaid, and one of the things I think it's worth pointing out is, and I know there were other leaders and founders as well. I was just with Sheikh Hamza earlier today, and he said that Liliana, his wife, she's a co-founder of this, and she was like, yes, I am. Sheikh Hamza and Imam Zaid, the two of them could have spent the rest of their lives speaking to thousands of adoring fans 5 nights a week. You know, kind of a greatest hits tour. They're the Eagles. And they did the painstaking work of building an institution. And as somebody who's built a little bit of one at IFYC, it is not sexy work. But it is work that has civilizational impact. And so for everybody here who has been involved in that, you know, Munir and his role at GTU, those of you who are students, those who have blessed it along the way, I just think, thank you, and these are the kinds of things that add new threads to our civilization. The final thing I want to say before beginning is that I'm a little bit sick tonight, and part of what that means is that I don't trust my improvisational muscles as much as I might, and so I never speak off a text, but I'm going to tonight because the ways that my brain works, I'm not entirely trusting right now. So I will play it close to the vest and close to the text. So what I wound up titling this is Seminaries and the Building of a Better Order. Part of what anybody who speaks knows is that they ask you for the title of your talk 6 months before you've actually written the talk, so I did the best I could. My friend Rabbi Josh Feigelson, the first Jewish dean of students at the Divinity School of the University of Chicago, recently found himself flipping through mid-20th century versions of Div School administrative handbooks, as one does at U of C. The book from 1934 to 35 contained the following. The purpose of the Divinity School is primarily and chiefly to fit men and women to serve the Christian church in 1, the pastorate, 2, the mission field, 3, Christian teaching, 4, other religious vocations, which might as well have read the rest of the society. This was probably a pretty standard self-narration for most Christian seminaries in the United States from their founding until the late 20th century. The worldview likely went something like this. Western civilization / Christendom required, that's all the arguing I did with Rabbi Lehman at dinner. Western civilization / Christendom required intellectuals, evangelizers, bureaucrats, and educators. The purpose of the seminary or divinity school was to prepare a steady stream of graduates, often the best and the brightest, for service in colleges, churches, government, and the many related institutions of Christian empire. Actually, you could make the argument that this is the original vision of much of higher education in the United States. Here is a line from a document written by the founders of Harvard on the purpose of the oldest university in the United States. After God had carried us safe to New England, and we had builded our houses, provided necessaries for our livelihood, reared convenient places for God's worship, and settled a civil government, one of the next things we longed for and looked after was to advance learning and perpetuate it to posterity, dreading to leave an illiterate ministry to the churches when our present ministers shall lie in the dust. In a book called The Soul of the University, George Marsden underscores that a similar vision to the one that inspired Harvard's founding animated much of higher education well past colonial times. Our current system of residential universities, Marsden writes, were, quote, founded and defined by men who came of age during the earth-shaking national conflict, the Civil War, and who inherited a sense of calling to serve God and nation in a cultural mission. I imagine no one here wants a return to that world. Even most of the Christians amongst us are not interested in the reestablishment of Christian empire, by which I mean nothing more nefarious simply than this, the assumption that the symbols, norms, language, and processes of our society ought to be Christian in nature and run by Christians. Frankly, this is the way most human societies have been able to assume for most of human history, cohesiveness based on a majority shared religious identity. While the deficiencies of this order are readily apparent to us, excuse me. its exclusions, its bigotries, its oppressions. I think, following my friend Robbie Jones of the Public Religion Research Institute, it is worth offering a few words as a eulogy. The first is that a certain degree of homogeneity is consistent with the way most religious communities have thought about faith formation for most of human history. The great social theorist Peter Berger called this a plausibility structure. When everybody goes to church on Sunday mornings, when all of the institutions of the society send the same signals, people experience their identity as fate. Diversity, some people praying differently, some people not praying at all, breaks down the plausibility structure. People no longer experience their identity as fate, but as choice. We moderns are, of course, accustomed to cheering for diversity and choice, but faith communities who view their ways of being, believing, and belonging as connected to salvation may, when pressed, confess that they prefer the old ways. And of course, it's not just Christians. My own Ismaili Muslim community attempted for many generations, at least in South Asia and East Africa, to build a kind of network of institutions that effectively formed a sealed bubble around its members. Excuse me. The line went something like this. I was born in an Aga Khan hospital. I knew I would be buried in an Aga Khan cemetery. In between, I was educated in an Aga Khan school, played sports in an Aga Khan gymkhana, and formed alliances with other Ismailis in Aga Khan business associations. Even the Aga Khan, the leader of the Ismaili community, consistently speaks of the sacredness of pluralism in his addresses to the public and in his private communications to the Jamaat. I have heard more than one elderly Ismaili grumble about how difficult it is to raise Ismaili children in this modern age, and how much easier and better it was to live within the bubble of Ismaili institutions. There is a certain telos and social coherence when a community or a society operates in this way. Andy Delbanco opens his remarkable book, The Real American Dream, with the following lines. Human beings need to organize the inchoate sensations amid which we pass our days, pain, desire, pleasure, fear, into a story. When that story leads somewhere, and thereby helps us navigate through life to its inevitable terminus in death, it gives us hope. And if such a sustaining narrative establishes itself over time in the minds of a substantial number of people, we call it culture. For most of the history of this nation, that sustaining narrative was what New York Times columnist Ross Douthat calls a Christian orthodoxy of a relatively generous sort, which means that it managed, over time, to be inclusive of many forms of evangelical and mainline Protestant belief, and over the course of the 20th century, parts of the Black Church, Roman Catholicism, and even Judaism. Yes, this Christian orthodoxy was narrow, bigoted, etc., in all the ways we commonly speak of now. But as it passes, it seems important to say a word about its contributions. Here is how Douthat describes it. Both doubters and believers have benefited from the role that institutional Christianity has traditionally played in our national life. Its communal role as a driver of assimilation and a guarantor of social peace, its prophetic role as a curb against our national excesses and a constant reminder of our national ideals. Both doubters and believers stand to lose if religion in the age of heresy turns out to be complicit in our fragmented communities, our collapsing families, our political polarization, and our weakened social ties. Both doubters and believers will inevitably suffer from a religious culture that supplies more moral license than moral correction, more self-satisfaction than self-examination, more comfort than chastisement. One more cheer for the ethos outlined above. It was, for a certain set of people and institutions, highly functional. Seminaries and divinity schools are amongst them. These institutions had a crucial service to offer. in intellectual and moral formation in Christian study and leadership. Incoming students knew at least the basic outlines of that service, and plenty of colleges, churches, and related civil society organizations wanted to hire the graduates on the other end. There were pulpits and professorships aplenty for the individuals who wanted these jobs, and an abundance of other organizations in civil society were hiring as well. One of my earliest mentors served as a YMCA professional for 50 years, a career spanning literally the entire second half of the 20th century. He would speak often about the days when most senior YMCA professionals he knew were graduates of divinity schools and seminaries. That's just the way that civil society organizations with a Christian founding operated. And the YMCA is no small organization. It's the second largest association in the United States after AAA. These days, if you go to the YMCA national offices in Chicago, you are more likely to run into someone with an MBA than an MDiv. I knew that would be a Before moving on, let me pause and summarize. For much of American history, a broadly Christian narrative gave significant segments of our society hope. That idea, to borrow a line from Emerson, or a metaphor from Emerson, drew after it a train of institutions that instantiated it into a particular order. Christian-inspired higher education, including seminaries and divinity schools, served as the purest expression of the Christian idea and the primary engine for its advancement. Part of what these institutions did was expand the boundaries of the Christian narrative to include more and more people, as in the idea of Judeo-Christian America. I want to highlight for a moment how remarkable this is. Everybody knows that America begins as a racist project. We also begin as an anti-Catholic project. So when John Winthrop sailed across on the Arbella in the 1630s, he came here to, quote, build a bulwark against the Antichrist, to escape the designs of Jesuits. The Pilgrims who landed in Massachusetts Bay were leaving what they viewed as the impurities of the Catholic Church, building a bulwark against it. Schlesinger once said that anti-Catholicism is the deepest bias in the American people. Okay. So part of the triumph of a generous orthodoxy, again, Christian empire is saying from the grave, I'm already dead, stop kicking dirt on me. So I pause to offer a eulogy for something that is already dead. Right? But how many of you woke up this morning worried about anti-Catholicism? America has largely eradicated it. Not everywhere, right? But largely. Is this not a triumph in a civilization that launches as an anti-Catholic project? It seems to me it is, and that it's worthy of recognizing that. These seminaries also graduated students who went on to lead many of the nation's key institutions. There was a smooth functionality to this system. Theological education prepared students for leadership, and they went on to fill the open pulpits, professorships, and offices of Christian empire. The seminaries had students in tuition. The graduates had jobs. The churches, colleges, and related organizations had pastors, professors, and staff. Those days are gone, and virtually no one that I know in the progressive theological circles in which I run, or in any of my social and civic circles, frankly, wants them to return. The twin trends of increasing diversity of all kinds and growing religious disaffiliation, combined with the broader forces of high modernity, fragmentation of media, the rise of expressive individualism, the suspicion of and flight from civic institutions, growing social and economic inequality, political polarization, loneliness, and isolation. All of this has brought us to, as my friend Robert Jones says, to the end of white Christian America. What comes next? The seminaries and divinity schools helped build the old order, one that gave hope to significant segments of the population for significant parts of our history, one that was able to expand to include at least some of the groups that it initially excluded. Jews and Catholics come to mind. The curriculum taught in these institutions helped call that old order into question, to highlight its glaring limitations and the injuries it caused to many. I viewed that too as a service, but it does raise a big question. Can institutions like GTU help build a new and better order? One that doesn't suffer from the bigotries, exclusions, and oppressions of the old order, but also isn't content only to criticize, or worse, to be a midwife to chaos. What would be the big idea of that new order? The idea that, to return to Emerson's metaphor, would carry a train of institutions and cities behind it, giving it expression, instantiating it in real life, serving as laboratories for further development and experimentation. I know that the idea of order is not especially in vogue these days, and for good reason. We live in political and economic times with not just glaring deficiencies, but also gross violations of human dignity. I am not arguing for the maintenance of any order, and I am certainly not defending this order. I am simply saying that after revolution, resistance, critique has to come, well, some sort of order. Human history is replete with righteous revolutions that ended in orders that were highly destructive. The challenge might be summed up like this: be careful how you overthrow the Shah. You might wind up with the Ayatollah. That is not a joke, by the way. That's a nation right now. One of my favorite texts on this is James Baldwin's The Fire Next Time. It's essentially the story of a dinner that Baldwin has with Elijah Muhammad in the 1960s. Baldwin accepts the invitation because the corrosiveness of white racism has boiled his blood to the point where he resonates with Elijah Muhammad's rage. But once at the dinner, listening to Elijah Muhammad talk in a serious manner about vilifying all white people as devils and speaking with seriousness about building a separate black economy, a sense of alarm starts to set in for Baldwin. While he understood the anger at the root of Elijah Muhammad's critique, he did not want to live in Elijah Muhammad's world. In fact, he considered it frightening. The Fire Next Time helped me understand the difference between a critique and an order. When a worldview functions as a critique, the best way to approach it is to wonder what it illuminates about the world. But when a worldview functions as an order, when it becomes the world, it has to answer questions of a different sort and of a higher standard. Does this order provide benefits to the widest possible number of people? Does it offer reasonable protections to those who would be at its margins? If you were behind Rawls's famous veil of ignorance, not knowing your identity before you entered the world, would you choose to live in this order? Is this a better order compared to other orders you know of or could imagine? Do you trust the people who propose to run this world? I think that last question is especially relevant for seminaries, for all of higher education, actually. Are our institutions designed to produce people we would trust to run a better order, not just to lead the revolution against the current regime? I think this is part of the genius of Lin-Manuel Miranda's Hamilton. Act 1 is all Hamilton the revolutionary. The man who is young, scrappy, and hungry, who promises to fan sparks into flames, who sees the ascendancy of his name and the independence of his nation as inextricably intertwined, who will lay down his life if it sets us free. The American Revolution needed that brash spirit, both to inspire it and to win a remarkably unlikely victory against a mighty empire with a mammoth army. But as the show goes on, we see Hamilton evolve. His mentor and patron, George Washington, reminds him that winning is easy, governing is harder. And so Act 2 Hamilton needs to cool his hot head, to make alliances, to negotiate and compromise, to build for the long term. He writes more than he fights, builds more than he protests. Instead of throwing rocks at the windows, he walks through the doors of fancy buildings into the room where it happens. My whole life changed when someone offered me a far more modest version of the same challenge in my early 20s. I was a fierce protester in my undergraduate days at the University of Illinois, and I both believed in the causes I championed, and if I'm honest, I enjoyed the attention that leading a march on the quad brought me. I took that same approach to my civic activities right after college. I regularly called out the leaders of global interfaith organizations for attracting audiences that were overwhelmingly white, male, and elderly, and for running conferences that were full of boring panels. I, of course, am now the one who serves on those boring panels. Welcome to middle age. Someone along the way played a far-seeing Washington to my young, brash Hamilton. Those ideas you have about the need for more young people and more action in interfaith work, those are great ideas. You know, instead of spending all of your energy criticizing other people for not doing enough along those lines, you should spend some of that energy thinking about how to make those ideas reality. You really ought to go build that. That was actually said to me in June of 1998, about 50 miles from here at Stanford University, at a conference of the United Religions Initiative. Building my own institution turned out to be much harder than criticizing the institutions that other people had built. I could no longer advocate only for my favored concerns. I now had responsibility for the whole affair, the budgets, the programs, the staffing, the strategy. As an activist, passion and daring were king. As an institution builder, competence mattered most. Did the organization do what I said it would do? When we get the occasional IFYC staff person who exhibits more of an activist spirit than an institution builder one, a spirit that criticizes in the name of purity rather than seeking to make imperfect, practical improvements. I repeat the line that started me on this path. That's a great idea. You should go build that. I am not being dismissive. Rather, I am showing the highest form of respect. That's a great idea. You should go build that. I have something of a similar call today. The suggestion that seminaries, divinity schools, related institutions have a distinct advantage in nurturing the people and the ideas that would not just critique the present regime, but that would create a humane new order. The core idea of that new order, the analog to the notion of Christian empire in yesteryear, I think is the building of a healthy, diverse democracy, a healthy, religiously diverse democracy. One reason that institutions like this one have an advantage in preparing the architects of this new order is because you speak about religion and spirituality when so few others in progressive circles want to. Sam Huntington was wrong about lots of things. The idea that religion plays a central role in human civilization was not one of them. This is absolutely the case when it comes to American civilization. Many of our most important thinkers on diversity were either deeply religious themselves, deeply reflective on matters of faith, or very frequently both. Michael Walzer reminds us that the United States is remarkable in being the world's first attempt at a religiously diverse democracy. He defines the challenge before us in this way. How are we in the United States to embrace difference and maintain a common life? Harvard's Danielle Allen points out that a democracy requires people to build trust with and thus talk to strangers. In fact, the more you are willing to talk to strangers, the more powerful you show yourself to be. Talking to strangers, Allen says, is a way, quote, to claim your political majority. In a diverse society, Allen insists, the strangers you talk to will likely be different than you. Such a society ought not strive for oneness. She explains, quote, the effort to make the people one as an e pluribus unum cultivates in the citizenry a desire for homogeneity, for that is the aspiration taught to citizens by the meaning of the word one itself. In contrast, an effort to make the people whole might cultivate an aspiration to the coherence and integrity of a consolidated but complex, intricate, and differentiated body. John Inazu points out that not only will the strangers you talk to be different, they will likely disagree with you on significant matters, especially those that deal with religion. We need to cultivate what he terms a modest unity amidst these deep disagreements and create a civic life that allows for dissent. American political philosophers have long wondered how much disagreement a diverse society can handle before it comes apart at the seams. The great Jesuit thinker John Courtney Murray reminds us that the definition of civilization is people living together and talking together. A diverse democracy is a type of civilization in which the political community holds the divergent views of diverse groups. We should never forget that this presupposes the strength of the underlying political community. Princeton's Jeff Stout says that managing disagreement is the defining quality of our society. He writes, quote, democracy takes for granted that reasonable people will differ in their conceptions of piety, in their grounds for hope, in their ultimate concerns, in their speculations about salvation. Yet it holds that people who differ on such matters can still exchange reasons with one another and do both of these things without compromising their integrity. That's the animating spirit of GTU, at the very least, the interfaith consortium that it is becoming. There is honored precedent to use religious language in the calls for justice, reconciliation, and community simultaneously. Lincoln's second inaugural, for example, highlights the deep offense against God and humanity that slavery is, recognizes it as one of the central causes of the Civil War, and yet ends with a call for all of us to move forward together, with malice toward none, with charity for all, with firmness in the right as God gives us to see the right. Let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to care for him who shall have borne the battle, and for his widow and his orphan, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nation. There is great wisdom in religious traditions for building just, inclusive, and reconciled communities. When Jesus was asked, "Who is my neighbor?" he responds with a story that elevates a man from a rival religion to a position of moral leadership and exhorts his community to follow the Samaritan's display of kindness and compassion. Gandhi emerges from a South African jail with the gift of handmade sandals for the man who had put him there, Prime Minister Jan Smuts. The Prophet Muhammad, may the peace and blessings of God be upon him. Boy, it feels good to say that in the first Muslim college in America. When asked to resolve a dispute between different Meccan clans about who would have the privilege of placing the holy stone in the Kaaba, suggests that they put the stone on a blanket and insert it into the shrine collectively, thus allowing each clan to claim credit while encouraging cooperation along the way. Religious traditions teem with such stories. I think religious institutions also have a sense of practical challenges in ways that more abstract and ideological progressive movements might not. Diversity progressivism as a paradigm rests on the belief that your favored identities will hold your preferred views. We are accustomed to hearing calls to listen to people of color, follow the leadership of minorities, center the marginalized when it comes to a whole range of issues, which political candidates to support, what curricular changes to make on campus, how the police should operate. Equally, we are convinced that the bad things in the world emanate from the identities we don't like. White cops beat black people, men sexually harass women, rich owners underpay poor laborers. But the world is far more complicated than any worldview. This is precisely the reality that progressive American Methodists confronted at their recent General Conference in St. Louis. The participants who were the least materially comfortable, who were the least politically free, the most marginalized in terms of their global positioning, namely the delegates from Africa and Asia, voted against full inclusion of many of my friends, my gay friends. So what do you do when you like someone's identity but not their politics? When the subaltern speaks and you don't like what she says? It would have been so much easier if all the opponents of the LGBTQ inclusion in the Methodist Church were rich, white, male, arrogant vulgarians. Any pictures come to mind? It is precisely because people in religious institutions come face to face with the complexities of human life on a regular basis, complexities that belie ideological orthodoxies of all sorts, that positions us to nurture leaders who can build a better world. We have direct experience of being part of global communities where significant segments hold views we find offensive. This is a treasure and an advantage. Unless those views are overtly racist or directly advocate violence, few of us would make the decision to declare our co-religionists apostates. In fact, when the people we disagree with get sick, we visit them in the hospital. That is not an ideology. That's called being a pastor. That's one of the great strengths of the place that we are in. We pastor to people who offend and would exclude us. Do we think that the New World Order will include only people who we agree with? That diversity is just the differences we like? Isn't it a remarkable strength that you have practice ministering to people with whom you disagree? This is preparation for leadership in a diverse world. We who are part of progressive religious communities have a heritage, a vision, a set of experiences that help us, to borrow from both Edward Markham and Pauli Murray, to draw a circle that draws more people in. Moreover, we recognize that ethic as not just the building of a better civil order, but as the fulfillment of a sacred duty. I want to end by quoting at length the greatest American of the 20th century, perhaps in all of the history of American civilization, Martin Luther King Jr., who famously wrote, "We have inherited a great world house in which we have to live together, black and white, Easterner and Westerner, Gentile and Jew, Catholic and Protestant, Muslim and Hindu. Because we can never again live apart, we must somehow learn to live with each other in peace." America, King believed, was humanity's best chance at getting that right. Because King believed it was written into the DNA of the nation. Here he is again. from a speech given at Drew University in 1964. America is essentially a dream yet unfulfilled. The substance of the dream is expressed in some very familiar words found in the Declaration of Independence. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with certain inalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. This is a dream. I'm still quoting King. Now, one of the first things we notice about this dream is an amazing universalism. It does not say some men, it says all men. It does not say all white men, but it says all men, which includes black men. It doesn't say all Protestants, but it says all men, which includes Catholics. It doesn't say all Gentiles. It says all men, which includes Jews. And that is something else at the center of the American dream, which is one of the distinguishing points, one of the things that distinguishes it from other forms of government, particularly totalitarian systems. It says that each individual has certain basic rights that are neither derived from nor conferred by the state. They are gifts from the hands of the Almighty God. Very seldom, if ever in the history of the world, has a socio-political document expressed in such profound, eloquent, and unequivocal language the dignity and the worth of human personality. I think that those eyes on that document come from the reverend part of the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the person who had as much right as anybody to declare America a lie and dismiss it, instead called it a broken promise and committed himself to building a better order. Jazakallahu khair, may God give you goodness. Thank you very much.
Eboo, thank you so much for that very stimulating, important, and I think inspiring, not only provocative, but inspiring talk. And we're going to take a few minutes for questions. We have a microphone here to my right, and if people want to ask a question, you can just come up to the microphone. It's important to use the mic so that everyone can hear. And we'll take a few questions for Dr. Patel and hopefully create a larger conversation here. Please.
If your question is too hard, I'm going to have a coughing fit. I'm just telling you now.
Thank you. I wish you better. So you enumerated a number of advantages that seminaries and divinity schools have in undertaking this work. I wonder if you could describe some of the areas where change might be necessary.
I think a ton of change is necessary, right? I'm not saying press go, I'm saying, here's what I'm saying. When you look at a graduate, do you think to yourself, I trust that person to run the new order? Not just to critique the old one. Maybe you do, right? I think it is a higher standard to build a new order, one that answers the range of questions about the breadth of affairs one inherits when one runs something, than it is to criticize the old order. And at some point, the old order is good and dead and gone, and a new one has to arise. Who will run it? What will it look like? Will it be better? Hamilton 1 is coming to an end, right?
Thank you for being here, and thank you for persevering. I hope you do feel better soon.
Thank you for that gentleness.
My question is, so it's hard to make change if you keep doing things the same way, right? So
Sorry, say that again.
It's hard to, you can't make change really if you keep doing things the same way. So I'm wondering what you want seminaries and divinity schools to be teaching.
So I think thank you for not letting me escape by not answering the question. Did you two tag team on this? You were like, the dude is going to sidestep the first one, but then I'm going to come around the. I think the next version of this talk would include an answer to this question. Come see me in Cambridge. I'm just kidding. I think that there might be something transferable to the functionality of seminaries under Christian empire. So basically, it's students are coming in, it provides this set of educational service, it provides graduates for these institutions. So if you line those things up, what do these institutions need now? The schools, the nonprofits, the civic institutions of a diverse democracy. What do they need now? Can seminaries think about the recruitment of students, the preparation of those students, and the graduating of them into the institutions no longer of Christian empire, but of a highly religiously diverse democracy, right? And those are still forming, right? So I'm going to give you a really simple, a really mundane, but I think fascinatingly important example. So you might be an activist seeking to get Eid on the holiday calendar of a public school. Good for you. Now imagine you're the principal of the school, and you know your Hindu population isn't getting any smaller, and you know your Buddhist population isn't getting any smaller, and you know your Chinese population isn't getting any smaller, and you don't know a ton about religious diversity, but you imagine that if there are Muslim holidays that the Muslim community wants off as public school holidays, that there's probably Hindu ones and Buddhist ones, and you've heard of this thing called the Jain tradition, and there's Baha'is and there's Sikhs, and so what if you're the person responsible for creating the calendar for a religiously diverse school and no longer the activist seeking to get your 2 days off? What does that look like? My experience, limited and narrow as it might be, is it's a whole different ballgame, right? So that school, the Park District, that is getting requests for female-only swimming hours based on religious identity. Those are the institutions of a religiously diverse democracy. Who will run those institutions? Why not these be the places that prepare leaders for those institutions? By the way, this is a super hard thing to do. It is so much easier to stand up here and say, y'all ought to do this, than it is to create that curriculum, recruit those students, let the high school in Cambridge, Massachusetts know that they ought to hire your graduate, right? That is a stunningly hard process. But my wild guess is that we are nearing intermission of Hamilton Act 1, right? Christian empire is at some point is going to, I said this at dinner, is going to whisper from the grave, okay, I'm dead, stop kicking dirt on me, right? What comes next? What comes next, right? I think that that's a little bit of, I think we're seeing glimpses into it. What does it look like to be the institution who can recruit the students, prepare those students, and graduate them into running that more expansive, more inclusive, more humane order?
Thank you.
it seems to me there's a lack of diversity of thought in the secular universities, and I'm wondering how the seminaries might be able to help improve that situation.
So there's 2,800 colleges and residential four-year colleges and universities in the United States. About 1,400 of them are public, about 1,400 are private. Of the 1,400 that are private, probably 800 were started by religious institutions, almost all Christian, right? So by the way, if you want to ask a question about, what good was this Christian empire thing anyway, 800 colleges and universities that largely serve the broad population with the exception of the handful of Wheatons and BYUs. BYU actually still lets in non-Mormons if you sign a behavioral statement. That's not a bad contribution to a civil society, right? What I mean to say in direct answer to your question is there's lots of examples of secular universities, right? And what you might think of as a secular university, there's a reasonable chance that was started by a religious community. So Syracuse, USC, Emory, Duke, all started by Methodists, for example. Just interesting to note. My favorite thing about religious diversity is you have to deal with disagreements and matters of ultimate concerns. I think the great lie about diversity work today in progressive circles is that it's only the differences you like, right? And I just every once in a while, I'll encourage a young person to go to an interfaith conference and they'll email me angrily and they'll be like, but those people believed, in a different God than I did. Or they believed in God in a different way than I did. And I'm like, what did you think you were going to? Right? What do you think interfaith means? Right? So what do you think diversity means? You think it's only egg rolls and samosas? Only things you agree with? Seriously. Right? So I am concerned that diversity work is not giving enough space to disagreement. Right? So I'm at Zaytuna today. Is Imam Zayd still here? Imam Zayd's still here, so I hope I'm not getting anybody in trouble. But I'm visiting Sheikh Hamza at Zaytuna today, and the security guard looks at me and says, "Are you Pakistani?" I'm like, "Do I look Pakistani?" He's like, "Oh, I wasn't supposed to ask. Diversity trainings, they teach you not to ask," right? But he couldn't stop himself, right? But it seems like a friendly, appreciative inquiry to me to be like, hey man, where might your heritage be from, right? So if that's de rigueur now, that's a view. That's not the whole kit and caboodle. You know what I'm saying? And so if that's the way that a segment of higher ed now just rolls, that occupies a certain worldview. My concern is it's pretending to be the world.
Right. Thank you.
Munir's like, man, you used that line on me earlier today. I had to practice with you.
Hi. I want to start by saying thank you for being here, and also as an upcoming IFYC alum, thank you for the work that you do. It's been really
thank you.
Inspiring, and I think I'm still an undergraduate student. I'm graduating, but I also feel a lot of being a young person and feeling angry sometimes about and having just a difficult time with disagreement and even I think with just knowing I think as I'm starting to learn and be more exposed to things and feeling with a lot of the oppressed identities that I have, feeling intimidated by making change, making an impact and feeling I'm not being heard, but then also wanting to respect and respect difference. And I was just wondering if there's any advice you would give to young people and trying to balance that it's okay to be to have disagreements, and then also sitting with feeling so tense, but also wanting to move forward and making an impact and making change and like going towards like a more like diverse religious and spiritual atmosphere.
Yeah, what a beautiful question. Thank you. Thank you for participating in IFYC's work and for being who you are and for asking that question. You know, there's this beautiful line by Gary Snyder. Who is he still alive, by the way? Yeah, right here, right? Like part of this whole crew of poets out in the Bay. He says, our job is to move the world a millionth of an inch. You know, I love that, right? Like this sense of what is your contribution? What is your contribution? I think that that's a discernment process. My own experience, if I were to think back to my own youth, I think the advice that I would give myself, this is just me, right? So I'm not telling anybody else how to roll. This is just me. Like the advice the middle-aged Eboo would give to the young Eboo is just be less self-righteous. Right? You learn less when you're self-righteous, right? Like, just be less self-righteous. You know, be grateful, right? Be grateful. Like that's in my mind. I was walking with Imam Zaid. Like gratitude is the heart of the tradition, Islam, right? It's the heart of the tradition, right? Like God gives us His message, and there's a spiritual version of that in every tradition, right? In the figure of Jesus in Christianity and chosenness in Judaism, right? But like that's so beautiful, like gratitude. And my experience is that feelings of gratitude and turning the volume down on my own self-righteousness made me maybe a better social change agent. You know, made people want to be around me more. Like I was the cat who was like a fire-breathing dragon in college, and my roommate didn't even want to come home. You know, he knew like a Workers of the World Unite speech awaited him. You know, he's like, man, I'm just getting my chemistry book, dude. You know, so that's just me. Like people are different, right? Like there's lots of different kinds of folks, and I am not by nature an angry person. So for the 15 months or so that I rolled that way, like it burned me up. That's not who I am by nature. Right? That's not who I am by nature. And look, I just think, you know, one of the things I love about King and Baldwin and Islam and Hamilton is this sense of you inherit this imperfect thing, and lots of people have benefited from this, and now it needs to get better. And you know that line at the end of Hamilton, America, that unfinished symphony you sent for me, right? Like, you know, I've been like in a bunch of countries around the world. There's no place, in my experience, like America, where a pair of hands can carve a piece of earth. It's so beautiful that you and we get the opportunity to do that. So why wouldn't I, like, as Joseph Brodsky said, until brown earth is crammed down my larynx, only gratitude will be gushing from it, right? That doesn't make me less radical. It just makes me better.
Thank you so much.
Hello. So I want to ask a kind of niche question on the topic of diversity that isn't nice to deal with. I think that one of the really big challenges around interfaith discussions is that you enter with the presumption that everyone is already on board with the faith aspect of it. And one of the big challenges I've encountered in my activism is trying to connect to and establish relationships to folks dealing with spiritual trauma, and folks for whom the very concepts of faith and religion carry so much emotional baggage that the fundamentals of my paradigm aren't even accessible to them. And I think that it's one of the big challenges in sort of broadening the conversation and making a truly diverse society is how do we help heal some of those rifts that have been caused by the institutions that we purport to be part of? And how do we broaden the conversation around faith and spirituality and those practices to the people who aren't already on board with those practices to begin with?
Yeah. So you say that's a niche question, but there's a world there, right? So thank you for that. Beautifully complex question. So our language for this at IFYC is how do you create a space where people who orient around religion differently can cooperate? And very frequently, it is easier to solve that problem in practice than in theory, right? And I think one of the great contributions of like American philosophy and social psychology is, what is the activity that is most likely to bring people together in which this dimension of their identity is likely to be salient? When it comes to different orientations around religion, I will give you the miracle that happens every 10 miles in America, and that's hospitals. So there are people like 8 blocks from here who disagree, like who have different views on the 10 most important issues in American public life. Actually, this is Berkeley. That may or may not be true, but at least 5 of them.
Yes.
Right? And they're like saving lives together. And what person A does to spiritually recognize a birth, they will accommodate. And what person B does, they will accommodate. And what person C does, they will accommodate. And if person D has a different understanding of a disease out of a spiritual worldview, most times, most doctors will try to figure out how to work within their frame of Western medicine and that other frame, right? So that activity, that space is a space in which it is easier for people who orient around religion differently to cooperate. And I think part of the task of the interfaith leader is to ask the question, what's the secret sauce of that space? How do I bottle it and take it over here, right? And so it might just be that addressing the challenge in the form of language is not the way to go about it. And finding inactivity is more along the way to go about it. On the question of spiritual trauma, I think I know what you're talking about. And to be really honest, I have no good advice on that. I know that people have experienced that. I'm not the right person to ask about how to deal with that, but I know it's real. I know it's real. So thank you for that. And I would hold that that's an important area. I just don't happen to be very good at it. One of the best things about being labeled a national expert on some things is I find it so much easier to say, I have no idea about a whole set of other things.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Good evening, Dr. Patel. Thank you for being here. My name is Ainita Adesai. I'm a doctoral student here in spirituality and history. I'm also representing the Interfaith Chaplaincy Institute, which is 20 years old and been training interfaith chaplains and ministers for 20 years. And I loved when you mentioned hospitals, because what I was going to lift up is that unique position of chaplain in the hospital, where they have to go in and no matter what their faith tradition is, serve and care for all, right? No matter who's in the room. I've been through that experience as a minister and chaplain myself. I hear you saying the world is about to turn. And what I'm wondering is if we shouldn't be looking at, we being seminarians and seminaries and divinity schools, looking at ways to partner, and someone brought it up in a different way earlier, but with secular institutions and almost other entities who impact worldview or hegemony, right? Because I wonder how important the spiritual life really is. You know what I'm saying? So I see the Chaplaincy Institute training up for all these years interfaith ministers and chaplains who are ready to serve in this, with this open, that's my in this open way, with with as little bias as possible because we're human. And yet they graduate and they go out and they're ordained, and they're, for the most part, then creating communities to serve versus going out to then be ready for that world that is about to change. And so I kind of see this almost the resistance. You said during your talk something about, like it was a common colloquialism, but you know, how either you're going to have, I don't want to use the wrong names, but this particular dictator or this worst one.
Right. Be careful about how you overthrow the Shah.
Exactly.
You might get the Ayatollah, right?
So partnerships beyond the religious academy, how does that fit?
So thank you so much for bringing up my sense is being a chaplain at a hospital is amongst the single best windows into the world that is coming. Because you have to negotiate, you're inspired by your framework, right? You come in because you're a Presbyterian or you're a Muslim or you're Jewish, right? That is what sustains you. And you have to be able to enter into any number of other spiritual or religious or philosophical worldviews. And you're constantly doing this, like you're constantly playing jazz between your own instrument and who this other person is. And you're talking to like 10 people an hour, right? And so I think an interesting research project for I don't know, a consortium of seminaries maybe to engage in is what is the expertise, the craft that an excellent interfaith hospital chaplain has to build? Okay. Let's imagine that at 8 layers of healthcare. Right? So I would do an ethnography where I'm following around 20 chaplains and interviewing them, open-ended interviews. What does this look like? If this hospital operated in way A+1 instead of just A, how would it help your ministry, to use a Christian term, right? So Cedar Sinai in LA has a Shabbos elevator. Anybody here heard of a Shabbos elevator? Okay, so super interesting, right? There's hospitals so as many of you know, observant Jews during the Sabbath will not use technology, including pushing buttons in an elevator. So if your loved one is on the 4th floor of Cedar Sinai Hospital or Berkeley Hospital, and you're an observant Jew, do you have to choose between breaking Shabbat, breaking Sabbath, and visiting your loved one or going to the hospital? You shouldn't have to, right? I bet you it was a chaplain that figured that out, right? Pope Francis tells this beautiful story about how when he was suffering from some ailment some 20 years ago, the doctor came in and like figured out his age and his weight and all these kind of very quantitative things and assigned him a certain amount of medicine. But a nurse came and sat by his side, figured out how he was really feeling, the pain he was going through, a little bit about his personality, changed the medicine, right? So what does that look like up and down the hospital? Wouldn't, in more religiously diverse hospitals, there's going to be a lot more examples of Shabbos elevators, right? And so an ethnography that looks at, or a research project that looks at how people who do jobs that are that swim in the waters of religious diversity now, how they navigate, operate the craft that they build, and then imagining that at multiple levels of those institutions. By the way, the one area of employment growth that we know we're going to have in the next half century is human services, right? People who know how to deal with people, and that's something that seminaries have been preparing people for from time immemorial.
Just to be clear, you're also saying that we need to be prepared for that in the corporate corporate boardrooms, and yes.
Absolutely. I just think there are fewer people to follow around who are already experts in that. Danny is saving me from myself and my voice. Okay.
And that will conclude it. Thank you.
Dr. Patel, thank you for your lecture, and thank you for the question. My name is Ruben. I work at the Pacific School of Religion. Thank you.
You work where?
At the Pacific School of Religion.
Oh.
Just right across the street here. Yeah, thank you for your question. Would you or do you trust your graduate to run the new world? And that's a fantastic question. It's going to linger with me. And it also raises another question for me, which is that the way you use the term order, this is a real genuine question, the way you use the term order, it's ambiguous, it's ambivalent. On the one hand, there's a level of training leaders who can vision, like Dr. King, as you concluded so beautifully with, could create a vision that ties together dreams, ideals, certain values that transcend the nation state and that which a nation state gives humans, in a sense, gives us, vice versa. So that there's that element of envisioning. On the other hand, when you're speaking of order, you're clearly identifying institutions. So my question is, which institutions, what are the new institutions? There are institutions that are dying, you're saying, and yes, there are plenty of things dying. Which are the new institutions that we are training our leaders for? Can you name some of them?
I have a
very
direct
specifically,
answer to
very
this.
concretely?
Yes.
Right.
Human services institutions. Healthcare, education, what we think of as civic institutions, YMCAs, schools, civic life, right? I would think to myself, I think hospital chaplaincy is an exceptional example of this. And I would just think of it up and down the chain, right? What does it look like to be the CEO of a hyper-religiously diverse hospital system that is able to care for in a full way people who orient around religion in a variety of ways? So for me, a super interesting fact is that people who orient around religion differently define death differently, right? So that's going to be a really interesting, as you have more Buddhists, Orthodox Jews, et cetera, who define death by breath, for example, instead of brainwaves, as in communities in which that's a critical mass, it's a really interesting way you got to think about a hospital, right? So health and education and recreation, that's like 50 or 60% of our civil society. That's like a lot of things right there. And by the way, it's places where graduates are already going, right? Places in which religious diversity will be felt the fastest. But they don't quite, there are probably very few hospital administrators who have a language or a category for religious diversity. So one of the interesting opportunities that I think seminaries and divinity schools have is helping them create that category, and once you do, it will be immediately populated, right? Like diverse definitions of death, different practices at birth, different definitions of disease. A hospital administrator, once given that category, will be able to think of 500 cases. We graduate people who have the vision, knowledge, skill set, and craft to work with those issues, and we do it beyond the chaplaincy. You know us as the people who graduate chaplains, but we are also able to do this whole set of things.
Yeah. What? Okay. I'll talk to you later.
Thank you for your talk, Dr. Patel. Interesting question to end on, I guess, but you talk a lot about a new order, right? Which, you talk, in a lot of ways you mentioned sort of cherishing and learning to embrace and work with diversity, and America being this incredible experiment in that regard, which hasn't really existed in history. And from that perspective, if there is an ideology of diversity, there's arguably in the world today also an ideology opposite to that, whether it's the president today or the attacks we saw on Friday or any number of things. There's no shortage of historical precedents for those sorts of things. But my question to you is, in light of that, in light of competing ideologies which have always been there, what gives you hope about 2019?
Yeah, man, like all kinds of things, right? Like all kinds of things. I mean, I watched Barack Obama go from a guy his neighbors didn't know to the president of the United States, and that's not a joke. Right? Like I come back to Chicago in late 2001 after being in England, and like this guy has gotten beaten by 30 points by Bobby Rush, a congressman on the south side of Chicago. And his credit cards are all maxed out, and he decides to run for president, or decides to run for Senate. And the first poll on Obama is done by a friend of mine, statewide poll, name recognition poll, and it measures an asterisk. It's not materially above zero. And I watch him go from like nobody to president, you know. So I just think that there's 100 stories like that. And that makes me hopeful. I mean, look, I'm a hopeful person by nature. I open my tap, this is gonna sound crazy, but I open my tap and clean water comes out. There's 7 billion people on the planet. Half of them can't do that. My dad was just in India. The air pollution in Delhi is 30 times the Indian government standard for air pollution. Walk outside, you can breathe the air. Right? And so, like, I just think to myself, like, I am so lucky. Make a contribution. I am so lucky. Right? I'll end with this line, but I was with John Powell earlier today, the guy who runs the Haas Institute and the Fair Inclusive Society. You all know him? I mean, talk about like living bodhisattva, right? He's just a beautiful presence to be in. We're talking about Baldwin. And towards the end of The Fire Next Time, after Baldwin's like, look, I understand your worldview, but I don't want to live in your world, right? He's like, okay, so then what? Then what? And he says a couple things that just like blow my, I'm reading this when I'm in India, I'm like 23 years old. And he says, I am not a ward of this nation. I am one of the first Americans to arrive on these shores. So this is a black gay guy in 1960 saying, you know what? I'm gonna flip the script. I'm not a ward of this nation. I'm one of the first Americans to arrive. I'm gonna put myself at the center of the story. I'm just gonna do that with a sentence. I'm gonna shift the worldview, right? And then he says, if we can create each other's consciousness, together we can achieve our country. And I just think to myself, like, how do I look at this man's insistence on hope and optimism and not have a shred of it myself when I'm 50 times better off and I inherit what he did for me? I just think it's like, for me, there is something, it is a violation of Islam to not be hopeful.
Thank you.
I want to thank Dr. Eboo Patel very much for his thoughts, provocative and inspirational, the conversation that ensued. I want to thank all of you for coming. I want to thank the leadership of the GTU Dean's Office for helping to put this together, and all the people in marketing and communications at GTU who helped spread the word about it. I also want to leave us with one thought that Eboo's talk provoked for me, which is, in addition to what kind of impact seminaries and graduate programs in religious studies can have on civic institutions in this potentially new order, I also think we need to be imagining what new religious institutions we're going to need, and how, since seminaries and our graduate programs produce leaders for religious institutions, not exclusively, but primarily, what kind of new, diverse, interreligious institutions does our society, our country, our world need? So thank you all very much for coming. Eboo, thank you so much for your talk this evening, and God bless.